The day my uncle told me to get out, he was wearing my grandfather's watch. I noticed that first, before the words even landed. The old Seiko with the cracked crystal that Grandpa had worn every single day for 40 years. My uncle had it on his wrist like he'd always owned it, like it had always been his, like everything else he was in the process of taking. "You've got until Friday," he said. He didn't look up from the papers on the desk. My grandfather's desk, in my grandfather's office, in the building my grandfather had built with his own hands. The apartment above the shop is part of the estate. We need to liquidate. I was 26 years old. I had worked at Mackenzie & Sons Hardware since I was 14, stacking shelves after school for $5 an hour because Grandpa said starting at the bottom built character. I'd given that place 12 years. I knew every supplier, every loyal customer who came in on Saturday mornings, every creak in the floor between the paint aisle and the electrical section. And my uncle was telling me I had 4 days to pack my things and go. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. He finally looked up. My uncle, my mother's older brother, the man who'd given a toast at my grandfather's funeral 3 weeks earlier about how family was everything, looked at me the way you look at a stranger who's overstayed their welcome. "That's not really my problem, is it?" he said. "Your grandfather left the business to the family. You're a grandson, not a son." The lawyers were very clear. I drove back to the apartment that night and sat on the floor of the kitchen because I couldn't make myself sit on the couch. I had $340 in my checking account. I had a 2009 Civic with a slow leak in the rear tire. I had a duvet that smelled like the cedar closet in Grandpa's old farmhouse because that's where it had come from when I moved in 6 years ago, and I'd never washed out the smell because I liked it. What I didn't have was anywhere to go. My grandfather had built Mackenzie & Sons from a single hardware stall at the Pemberton Farmers Market in 1978. By the time I was born, it was a proper shop on Main Street with 6 employees and a loyal customer base that stretched across 3 townships. He wasn't a wealthy man by anyone's measure, but he was steady. He was the kind of man who showed up, who fixed things, who kept records in a spiral-bound notebook and paid his suppliers 2 weeks early because he believed in keeping his word. He'd never married again after my grandmother died. He had 2 children, my mother and my uncle, and when my mother moved to Vancouver with my father when I was 3, Grandpa and I stayed close through summers and school breaks, and eventually through me choosing to come back and stay. My uncle had moved to Calgary in his 30s, started a financial planning firm, came home for Christmas when it suited him. And now he had the watch and the business and the apartment above the shop, and I had until Friday. I called my mother that night. She was furious in the quiet way she gets furious, where her voice goes very level and she chooses each word carefully. She said she was going to call a lawyer. I told her not to spend money she didn't have. She said she was sorry. I said I knew. After I hung up, I sat in the dark for a long time. Then I thought about Grandpa's fishing cabin. It had been sitting empty for 11 years. He'd bought it in the 90s from an old trapper who was moving into assisted living in Barrie, 30 acres outside a small town in the Muskokas, right on a lake with a name I could never spell correctly. The cabin itself was maybe 800 square feet, with a wood stove, 2 small bedrooms, a kitchen that had last been updated sometime around 1967, and a porch that faced the water. Grandpa had taken me there twice when I was young. I remembered the sound the screen door made. I remembered the way the lake looked in the morning before anyone else was awake. He'd left the cabin to me, specifically to me, in a separate paragraph of the will, with a handwritten note attached that his lawyer read aloud in a voice that cracked slightly at the end. For Adrian. Because you always asked about the fishing. My uncle hadn't contested it. The cabin wasn't worth contesting. It had been sitting empty for over a decade. The access road washed out every spring. The property taxes were paid up. Grandpa had been meticulous about that, but beyond that, nobody had set foot in it since the year my grandfather's knees got bad enough that the drive wasn't worth it anymore. I loaded my Civic on Thursday night. It didn't take long. I didn't have much. I got to the cabin on a Friday morning in late March, and the first thing I noticed was that the porch railing had collapsed entirely on the left side. The second thing I noticed was that a family of raccoons had found their way in through a gap in the soffit and made themselves comfortable in the back bedroom. The third thing I noticed was that the smell, damp wood, old ash, something green and cold from the lake, was exactly the same as I remembered. Underneath all the rot and the years and the animal mess, it smelled the same. I stood in the doorway for probably 5 minutes just breathing it in. Then I put my bags down and started making a list. The list was long. The roof needed patching in at least 4 places I could see from the ground. The porch required full reconstruction. The back bedroom floor had soft spots that went right through to the joists. The kitchen plumbing was corroded, and the pipes under the sink had likely frozen and cracked at some point in the last few winters. The wood stove needed the chimney swept before I could safely use it, which meant I needed to figure out the heating situation fast because it was still getting below zero at night. I had $340. After I bought groceries and a bag of chimney sweep supplies from the hardware store in town, I had $212. I am not a contractor. I want to be honest about that. I knew how to stock shelves and talk to customers and order inventory. I knew which brand of wood filler held up best in temperature changes because Grandpa had drilled supplier knowledge into me since I was a teenager, but I'd never done a structural repair in my life. I'd never replaced a floor joist or repointed a chimney or rebuilt a porch from scratch. The library in town had a decent renovation section. The woman at the desk, who introduced herself without being asked and seemed genuinely pleased that someone under 60 was checking out a book on foundation repair, pointed me toward a corner shelf where someone had thoughtfully organized everything by project type. I borrowed 6 books on my first visit and 4 more the week after. I watched videos on my phone in the evenings, sitting close to the wood stove once I'd gotten it running safely. I learned the difference between sistering a joist and replacing one. I learned how to test for soft spots in a floor before you committed your full weight to them. I learned that the porch railing hadn't just collapsed. The ledger board had been improperly flashed when it was originally installed, probably in the 1980s, and water had been getting in behind it for decades. Whoever built it had made a mistake that took 30 years to fully reveal itself. My uncle didn't call. My mother called twice a week. The first few times, I could hear the worry underneath her voice like something humming below the conversation. After a while, when she could tell I wasn't falling apart, the calls got easier. She started asking about the project instead of asking if I was okay, which felt better for both of us. I found a local building supply place about 20 minutes down the highway that let me buy in small quantities without the markup of the big box stores. The owner, a man about 10 years older than me with permanently paint-stained hands, figured out on my 3rd visit what I was doing and started putting aside offcuts for me. He never said anything about it directly. He'd just have a pile of usable lumber sitting by the door when I came in, priced at something that didn't make sense unless you accounted for the fact that he was being kind. The days settled into a rhythm. Up before 7, work until the light went, eat something, read, sleep. Some days were pure failure. There was an afternoon in April where I tore out a section of subfloor and found that the rot went further than I'd expected, and I had to sit outside on the good part of the porch for 20 minutes before I could go back in. There was a morning where I drove the only screw I had in the right size through my thumb instead of the board I was aiming for, and had to drive myself to the walk-in clinic in town with a rag wrapped around my hand. And the doctor there, a woman not much older than me, looked at the wound and then at my face and said, "Renovation project." And I said yes, and she said without any judgment at all, "It gets easier," which I found more comforting than she probably intended. But the rhythm held. The porch came back first, solid, level, properly flashed this time. Then the roof patches. Then the back bedroom, new subfloor, new flooring laid over it, the smell of fresh wood shavings mixing with the old cedar smell of the place until the whole cabin felt like it was breathing again. It was sometime in May, 6 or 7 weeks in, when I started on the master bedroom. The master bedroom was at the back of the cabin, the one that faced the lake. It was also the larger of the two rooms, and it had clearly been where my grandfather slept when he was here, because his things were still in it. A wool blanket on the stripped mattress frame, a paperback novel on the nightstand with a bookmark still in it, a pair of reading glasses in a case on the windowsill. I'd been avoiding that room. I told myself it was because the floor was solid and I needed to prioritize the structural repairs, but honestly, I just wasn't ready to go in there yet. When I finally did, I started by measuring, and that's when I noticed it. The room was roughly 12 feet across, but the wall on the east side, the wall that backed up against the exterior, felt wrong. I stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time before I understood what I was seeing, or rather, what I wasn't seeing. From the outside of the cabin, I'd estimated the bedroom at about 14 feet. From the inside, it measured closer to 10.5. That's a lot of wall. I knocked on it. Hollow. Not hollow like thin drywall, hollow like there was a space behind it. I told myself there were 100 explanations. Old insulation cavity. A poorly designed double wall for weather. A mistake from the original build. But I kept thinking about something. When I was maybe 9 or 10, Grandpa and I were sitting on the dock, and I'd asked him why the bedroom in the cabin was smaller than the one I slept in at his house in town. He'd said something I hadn't understood at the time. Some rooms are bigger on the inside than they look from the outside. I'd thought he was being philosophical. He had a habit of saying things like that. I went and got my pry bar. The access panel wasn't obvious. It was disguised as part of the baseboard trim, fitted so carefully that if you weren't looking for it, you'd never see it. Grandpa had been a meticulous man. He'd built this to stay hidden until someone decided to look. Behind the wall was a space about 3.5 feet deep and the full width of the room. Shelving had been built along the back, rough but solid, the kind of carpentry that prioritized function over beauty. On the shelves were metal document boxes, the kind with the locking clasp, 7 of them, each one labeled in my grandfather's handwriting, and in the corner, wrapped in oilskin cloth and sealed with electrical tape, was something flat and rectangular that turned out to be a ledger. Not a financial ledger, a record ledger. Names, dates, transactions, notes written in Grandpa's careful printing going back to 1986. I sat down on the cabin floor with the ledger in my lap and started reading. By the time I understood what I was looking at, the sun had moved across the floor by about 2 hours. My grandfather had not been a wealthy man. That part was true. But he had been a careful one, and careful men sometimes see things coming long before anyone else does. He had documented, systematically, over decades, every instance where money from Mackenzie and Sons had been redirected. Supplier invoices paid twice, and the duplicate pocketed. Inventory adjustments that didn't match the physical count. A renovation loan taken out on the shop building in 2009, where the work was only partially completed, and the rest of the draw disappeared. My uncle had managed the books from Calgary, remotely, since 2008. He'd done it as a favor, he'd said. He had the financial background. It only made sense to let him handle it. The document boxes held receipts. Bank statements, copies of checks, everything cross-referenced with the ledger, everything labeled in that patient, unhurried handwriting. My grandfather had known. He'd known for years, and he hadn't confronted my uncle, and he hadn't gone to the police, and he hadn't written him out of the will. He'd done something else instead. He'd built a wall. He'd put everything behind it, and he'd left the cabin to the one person in the family who he knew would actually fix the place, which meant the one person who would eventually find it. For Adrian. Because you always asked about the fishing. I sat there on the floor for a very long time. I want to be honest about what came next, because I think it matters. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel like I'd won something. I felt the particular sadness of finding out that a person you loved had been carrying something heavy and hadn't told you, and you understood why they hadn't told you, and that made it sadder, not less. My grandfather had watched his son steal from him for years and had chosen to protect the business, protect the family, protect me from having to deal with it while he was still alive. He'd been 81 years old, and he'd been managing this the way he managed everything. Quietly, carefully, without drama, leaving the right tools in the right place for the right person to find when the time came. I drove to Pemberton the next morning. I stopped at the Tim Hortons on the edge of town and sat in the parking lot for a while drinking a coffee I didn't taste. Then I called my mother. She went quiet in a way I hadn't heard from her before. Not the careful quiet of anger, just quiet. And then she said, "He never said a word." "No," I said. "How long?" "At least 15 years, maybe longer." She didn't say anything for a while. Then, "What are you going to do?" I told her I was going to see a lawyer. The lawyer I found was a woman in Barrie who specialized in estate and business law. I spread the documents out on the conference table in her office, and she went through them without saying much, just occasionally making a small sound that I couldn't interpret. At the end, she looked up and said the word I'd been waiting to hear from the moment I found the ledger: actionable. My uncle's financial planning firm was licensed in Alberta. There are regulators for that. There are provincial securities commissions, and there are estate lawyers, and there are forensic accountants who specialize in exactly this kind of thing. And my grandfather, bless him, careful man that he was, had done most of the forensic accounting himself. I will not pretend the process was quick or easy. It took months. There were lawyers on both sides and phone calls I dreaded, and one video meeting where my uncle tried to tell me that Grandpa had been confused in his later years and the records I'd found were misinterpretations of legitimate accounting practices. And I had to sit very still and not say the things I wanted to say. But the records were clear. My grandfather had been meticulous. He'd been right about everything. My uncle did not go to prison. I want to be straightforward about that. What happened was a civil settlement negotiated between lawyers that involved him repaying a significant portion of what had been taken from the business over 15 years, with interest. He surrendered his financial planning license. He no longer has anything to do with Mackenzie and Sons. The hardware store is still on Main Street in Pemberton. I run it now. Not because I wrested it back. The business was legitimately left to the family, and untangling that was its own complicated process, but because once everything came to light, nobody else wanted to deal with it, and I was the only one who knew where everything was kept anyway. I kept the same suppliers. I kept the same Saturday morning regulars. I ordered inventory from the same people Grandpa had dealt with for 30 years, and I paid them 2 weeks early because I believe in keeping your word. The cabin is finished now. The porch is solid. The roof doesn't leak. The back bedroom has new floors and new light, and the windows face the lake so that in the mornings, the first thing you see when you wake up is water. I kept the wall, not the false one. I took that down entirely, but I kept the shelving that was behind it, built into the space that used to be hidden. I use it for books now, and for the things I don't want to lose. Grandpa's paperback with the bookmark still in it. The reading glasses from the windowsill. The Seiko watch, which my uncle returned as part of the settlement, which I got serviced by a watchmaker in Barrie, who replaced the crystal and cleaned the movement and handed it back to me in a small box, with the comment that it was a very good watch and had been well taken care of. I wear it every day. Last summer, my mother came out to the cabin for a week. We sat on the dock in the evenings and watched the light change on the water and didn't talk about my uncle and didn't need to. One evening, she picked up one of the books I'd left on the porch rail and looked at the cover. It was the Foundation Repair Manual from the library, which I'd eventually bought my own copy of. And she laughed, a real laugh, and said, "He would have loved watching you do all of this." I think he did, in his way. I think he planned it that way. I think he sat in this cabin, looking at this lake, and thought about what kind of person his grandson was, and decided that the best thing he could do was leave him something broken and trust that he'd figure out how to fix it. He wasn't wrong.